You were asking for it. You were asking for it.
Very simple. Everyone. Even you and me.
Period. Awesome. Thank you. And there are things that are regulated in a better way, but why are we not moving further
Because
along?
it's a huge thing that we need to move, as you put it. I mean, it's a massive system which has relied on hydrocarbons forever.
What else are we waiting for?
Nothing really. I think what we were missing before was the awareness of the problem. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, when I started to work in renewables, this was a nice to have a fancy type of add-on to your energy mix. The topic of sustainability and the fight for climate change seem to be sitting a little bit behind.
Who is responsible for the transition? The government, regulators, market, private?
I'm very proud you didn't have to press the red button.
Welcome back to another episode of The Switch. Not another podcast, a podcast where we want to entertain you, educate you about everything that has to do with the green transition we need to do. And this is a podcast produced together with DNB and Baseload Capital. My name is Kristina Hagström-Ilevska and I'm the naive optimist with rebellic streak. And to support me, I have Jacob, I have Emil behind the scenes. Are you ready, boys?
Of course we're ready. Looking forward to it. Yeah.
Definitely. Let's move into the introduction. The expansion of green energy is accelerating faster than ever, and renewable power capacity keeps breaking records and reaching new all-time highs. In the midst of this is today's guest. His guilty pleasure is that he doesn't drive an electric car yet, and he likes Formula 1, but he compensates for that by being an investment manager that does something good every day he works. His job is to run the Center of Excellence for Renewables, ESG and Infrastructure at DNB. And in his profession, he stays in touch with the very key players of transition, the technology providers, the investors, and the regulators. I'm eager to see what he has to say about the road ahead. Let's give a warm switch welcome to Salvatore. Welcome.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
In your studio.
What an intro. I am impressed.
Yeah? You're not intimidated by your own intro then?
Not at all. I'm on it. Easy.
It must feel good though to know that you are going to your work and actually doing something good for the world every day.
That's fantastic. I was joking with you when we were discussing this. It's nice to be an investment banker, having to maximize performance. Obviously, our objective is also to make money, but doing it in a way where I feel when I go back home in the evening that I'm doing something which is better for the kids and the future.
Yeah, I can imagine that. With that said, I'm actually eager to get to know a little bit more about you because we're going to talk about the profession, but what about you as a person? Mm-hmm. Let's see what the Wheel of Questions has to say for you.
Wheel of Questions. What did you want to be when you were small?
So many things at different stage in life. I think I went the usual policeman, and then it became a truck driver, then an engineer, but then pretty quickly went into finance. So when I was small, I think it would be irrelevant.
When did you transition into finance?
When I moved to London.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's when London was very much giving young undergraduates like myself that feeling that unless it's finance, it's not good enough. And that's when I started to get a bit more flirty with banks and finance.
Good one. You know what I wanted to be?
No, I'm just
ballerina and military in the same thing.
At the same time?
At the same time. I'm not sure how that worked out, but I ended up here.
Could be a killing weapon.
Oh, good one. Let's roll on to the next question.
Wheel of questions. If you were a ruler of your own country, what would be the first law?
Why, the country doesn't have any?
It's your country.
The first law?
Yeah.
I mean, you need to write a constitution. I mean, you need to have a set of rules. I wouldn't know what would be the first one. Maybe everybody being nice to each other. Let's get away without criminality. Start from there, and then you start to build structures on it.
I think that law is actually missing in every constitution in the world, but I would actually enforce that definitely as well. Thank you very much for letting us know you a little bit. Now we want to go into your profession and where you come in from. And if we look at like what technologies do you consider are the most important for to accelerate the transition?
Yeah. So, I mean, to accelerate the transition, you need to have volume. The problem is big. We need to have a big solution. The big solution needs to come from technologies which are readily deployable and, to be honest, financeable. So I think we need to start from those that are big already. So
how do you know when something is
financeable?
Yeah.
I'll come to that in a second. So basically the ones that I think will be the winner, the one I will pick, they are the one that exists today. So that's wind, solar, large scale. Because that's large scale that is going to give us the ability to switch. The financeability of a technology or a type of solution, it depends a little bit on how proven it has been. Fortunately or unfortunately, the big capital flow, which could be bank financings or institutional investors like pension funds and the likes, putting money into projects, will only go to those projects which have a proven ability to deliver over the very long term. So
How much is a long term?
Long term, well, I don't know, but a sense for it would be at least having had functioning system for 5 to 10 years. I mean, that's where wind and solar really became big, when they were basically in the market for roughly that time. But it depends. I mean, it's very much technology dependent. When you have smaller technology, I think they will need a little bit more time to be consolidated, proven, to then become mainstream. And once they are mainstream, they can be then deployed globally to reduce carbon emission, help out with electrification or whatever we are focusing on.
You mentioned a couple of technologies now. What else are we waiting for?
Nothing really. I think what we were missing before was the awareness of the problem. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, when I started to work in renewables, this was a nice to have, a fancy type of add-on to your energy mix. What was missing then was the awareness of the issue we have today with global warming and what have you. But now that awareness seems to be here, governments and regulators are acting to try and do more. So we're not missing anything. We just need to get on with deploying capital, building capacity. And that, unfortunately, takes the technical time that it takes to go through. Plus, you know, the bumps on the road that we're facing, higher inflation, conflict, increase in energy prices, etc.
You meet a lot of technology providers. What are they saying? What are their challenges and what are their opportunities?
On the technology provider side, I would say that I will see two fields, as we just discussed. You know, so they are the ones that are sitting on a technology which is readily deployable, financeable, and therefore it's just a matter of getting more volumes out. And then there is a whole other group, which are the technology provider, which are trying to prove that their technology is viable. And there the difficulties are different. We need to find a way for them to prove that technology, to make it become mainstream and eventually deploy it at size like we're seeing now with the mainstream renewable sources.
These current technologies, can they be used in new ways? Because it feels like we're missing a piece here.
An example of a current technology which has been used in a new ways, if you want, has been wind going from onshore to offshore and now to floating offshore. That's the same technology which has been deployed differently to try and solve the issue of not in my backyard in some jurisdictions where people don't want to see onshore turbines on land, and also to try and get further out in the sea with floating, so to be able to catch better wind without having to bottom fix those machines, which will be way too expensive. So that's how a similar technology has improved, if you want that parallel.
But going back again, I mean, you're mentioning now we have the awareness, we have the technology, and there are things that are regulated in a better way. But why are we not moving further along?
Because it's a huge thing that we need to move, as you put it. I mean, it's a massive system which has relied on hydrocarbons forever, which now needs to transition towards a totally different source. So it does require time. So I think we are moving fast. If you look at all the stats when it comes to installed capacity, capital deployed, all these stats, they're all pointing up, but it does take time for us to switch a world economy which has been based on one system into a totally different one. Things could be improved. You know, everybody talks about, should the local authority be quicker in approving permits to do project here and project there? Yes, for sure. So things can be improved, but it's a matter of the governments acting together to try and transition. This is happening with, as I said before, the bumps on the road of different geopolitical issues that we're facing.
Are we lacking collaboration?
We do. I mean, at a very high level, you have collaboration going in and out. I mean, there used to be a fairly synchronized effort to do better. Think about COP, think about Paris agreements. But you obviously know when you have a war in Ukraine and you have China and the US having issue with each other, then the agenda seemed to be switching priority from what used to be the solving of the climate issue into geopolitics at the time. So those are things that are unfortunately pushing down a bit on the agenda of those world leaders, the focus on what we need to do to remedy the dependency we have today on fossil fuel.
Which is a super exciting question to go into. I mean, how do we make sure that this topic stays important? Because as you said, there are so many things happening in the world, and every time it pushes down, we are running into a new obstacle.
Yeah, we see it in Sweden. Have you seen Greta recently on the news?
Actually not.
No, and that is because that issue has unfortunately taken sort of a backseat at the moment into a world geopolitics plus inflation. There is a lot of discussion about that. Energy prices, conflict in Ukraine, which I think unfortunately seems like the attention span of the world has somewhat been used by all those topics, and the topic of sustainability and the fight for climate change seem to be sitting a little bit behind. Not right, but that is what is happening.
What do you think we need to do in order to change that?
I think we need to bring back that awareness that we have had and we still have, but there is somewhat subdued today. I mean, the climate-related event we've seen during this summer, the extreme high temperature, the effect on water levels, I think these are all facts that maybe need to be brought more to the attention of the regulators, the governments, for them to realize that while the geopolitical issues are distracting us from climate, the problem is still here. It's actually becoming worse. Because, I mean, as you saw, we have a situation where Germany might need to go back to coal because they are losing the gas supply from Russia. I mean, that is going back. So to an extent, we need to be not just equally concerned, we need to be more concerned because we might be going backwards for a number of years because of what has happened recently when it comes to energy supply sources and the ability or not of certain governments in Europe to having to switch back into either nuclear, paradoxically, the least of the problems, or coal.
Interesting. To add to that, I'm thinking that also where money goes, interest goes. If we're switching into the perspective of investment in this sense here, like there is a lot of technologies availability, but how is the money there, and
is
where
the money
are
there? So there maybe the spot is a little bit brighter, particularly in the Nordics. The large pension funds, insurance company, the institutional capital in the Nordic has been very quick in wanting to be more green. So they have set very strict targets on how much of their portfolio should go towards sustainable investments with all the ESG ratings that go with it. And they've been very clear on what can't go towards unsustainable businesses and exposures. So from that point of view, I feel more comfortable because I am seeing that the global funds, they are all talking about their sustainability strategy. And that's coming all the way from the local pension funds of small municipality in Germany, all the way to BlackRock and their 7 trillion asset under management, where they are really much saying our capital needs to be allocated towards sustainable business strategy. And the interesting part, not just because it's nice, but because unless you do that, you have got an investment underperformance, because most likely those businesses which are unsustainable, they are not likely to perform as well as those that have got a clear sustainability strategy.
So you think that they will clean out themselves?
To a larger extent, I think we're going to see more and more of an attention by the investors on how their money is being used. That will translate in pressure on management in demonstrating that their business is running more sustainably, and that in turn will determine those businesses running better. One interesting fact is that we early on this sustainability and sustainable finance question, we had this a bit of a switch. Something was either green or it was not. First, we started to see the definition of green shades to help some business that maybe were not fully green to still do better. And now we have seen the incoming structure of sustainability linked loans or bonds, which is a mechanism which will allow any business, including those that would not intuitively feel very sustainable or green, to improve on what they're doing so that there is a link in them achieving a better or worse pricing on their securities, for example. So the introduction of a sustainability linked instrument is helping businesses which would have not been picked up from a green or no green perspective to get better and better. And that's then being applicable to the entire corporate community, and therefore basically now everybody's involved. So from an oil refiner all the way to a wind farm, you could do better on your sustainability target.
You mentioned oil and gas, and they claim to finance and commit to green transition. So what you're saying here is that they are actually doing that because they have been accused very much for green washing and so on. Is that, how do you think of that question at all? Can you be green if you are an oil company?
If you are an oil company, probably you cannot be green, but you could be greener or you could be less darker. So if a large oil major is deploying a sizable amount of capital to build offshore wind farms, that's better than if they didn't. Exactly. And that's better than if they did something very small just to have on an annual report. But if there is a material investment towards alternative energies, I would rather take that, and I would rather give them that sustainability linked instrument to say the more you do, the better you will be treated by the capital markets or by the loan markets. So I think there is still merit in them progressing. After all, we're not looking for perfection, we're more looking for progress in some of those businesses that need to switch away.
So, because this, listening to you gives me hope, because I mean, there has been critique towards the industry towards like finance industry in generally, that you go where the money is in a sense. But what you mean is that all of these like EU taxonomy, all of these initiatives, they are coming true through investing companies. Can I read you like that?
Yes, I think so. So this is not a matter of nice to have, it's becoming a matter of critical to have also from an investment performance point of view.
We all agree that we need to move faster. Capital is available, and you're mentioning that technologies is as well. But what about the regulators? Where are they in this?
Yeah, a super interesting question. So for good and bad, they are not as critical as they were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, these technologies we're talking about, wind, solar, hydro, they might have needed subsidies because they were not commercially viable at their cost base. So there, the regulator had, back in the days, a very important role to play by setting the right structures, being contract for differences, feed-in tariffs, so to be able to, for that technology to be deployed. The very good news is this technology now has reached grid parity. It is called, and grid parity is a term used to say that, they are competitive without the need for any support, at least most of them. And with grid parity means that the regulator doesn't need to incentivize it anymore. So the role of the regulator over the last 10 years has been heavily curtailed down to what is now only the permitting part of it in certain jurisdictions. So wind in Sweden is at grid parity, and I will say that solar in Southern Europe is definitely at grid parity. So the regulator now has got less to interfere with, if you want. Mostly is only related to their ability to quickly permit and allow us to build those projects.
But what about, you're mentioning solar and wind, what about new technologies, let's say geothermal, in a sense? I mean, as soon as there is something new, a new opportunity, we go back to slow again.
So new technology like geothermal, very interesting, because I think you're bringing up a new topic, and that is baseload versus non-baseload type generation capacity. And we could talk then about the fact that, we do need some technology which is more stable in their ability to perform. Wind and solar are very weather dependent. So that's the advantage there. It's pretty well established as a technology, and we think that potentially at a smaller scale, more flexible, more modular, could actually work slightly better, because historically geothermal in the specific has had a bit of a hit and miss on very large investments being done, and then some issues in relation to the resource.
Yeah, but and I agree with you, but I think that there are many other technologies and initiatives like geothermal, where I think that it needs regulatory support in a different way. It needs to be public support and political support, but that goes slow. What is your comment on making sure that the regulatory system keeps up with the inventions and what is going on in the world, actually?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there is going to be always a need for the regulators and the governments to be aware and attentive to what do we need to support next. In a sense, they've managed to bring wind and solar off the cliff of commercial viability. Sure, we should try to find other sources to be able to go. So you mentioned geothermal. Another one that is very interesting is like biogas and how much we are using of that in our economies. So there are a number of technologies that should be supported to be brought over that kind of commercialization cliff, where they become then viable without need for further support.
It's super interesting discussion in a sense. To summarize this part, who is responsible for the transition? The governments, regulators, market, private?
Very simple. Everyone. Even you and me.
Period. Awesome. Thank you. Good one. Thank you. It's time to hear from our future. What questions does the kids have for you, Salvatore?
Questions from our future.
What do you want me to do different than your generation?
You should definitely be much more aware of the resources you're using when you make certain choices.
Can you explain?
buy this item or buy that item, or decide to take this trip or not. I think we'll all need to be more aware that there is a much heavier usage of resources in what we do than what maybe we perceive.
How can we make our kids more aware then?
I think this is gonna come. Everything we'll choose to do will have much more transparency on the implication of those choices. So to try and get people to pick those choices which have lesser of an effect when it comes to climate or sustainability.
To create awareness, there is a cost, both time and investment. Who's responsible for this? Is it the public, the governments, the markets? Who's responsible for making sure that we are more aware?
I think this will be one that has to be tackled by the regulator. So any service you provide, any goods you sell, needs to come with a very clear and transparent information on the implication, the user resources, the impact that service or that product is having. So the regulator needs to do it. Then we could argue who's paying for it. Is that the regulator, is that the government, or is that the taxpayer? Because at the end of the day, if you go long enough in that chain, all goes back to the taxpayer.
Do you have hope that we will solve this?
I do have hope, and I think we need to have hopes, and we need to have, strength to work through to try and contribute. So I do.
I'm happy to hear that. For every transition and change, there needs to be some uncomfortable conversations. What uncomfortable conversation do you think that we're missing now that we need to have?
Uncomfortable conversations.
I guess there could be many. One topic that has really affected me recently when I was having some discussion with clients and all that is that there has been a very strong emergence of evidence that some of the supply chain behind some of the technology which we are all praising as a solution for climate change, and I'm referring now to manufacturing of solar panel, might actually be affected by exploitation of laborers in the locations where these panels are being manufactured, which is mostly China. So I guess the uncomfortable conversation there is that we need to realize that even in doing well, you need to have full visibility on how that good is being delivered, so to make sure that there are no negative implications. And obviously, the use of forced labor in China for the purpose of producing a panel, which then could be installed on your rooftop in Stockholm, that's a not very sustainable way of switching away from your usual source of energy into solar power. So that's an uncomfortable discussion to be had, because there is an element of bad in wanting to do well, but that is one that now has come to the surface and is under the spotlights of financing parties and regulators. And I'm sure that with that attention, there will be hopefully more transparency, and therefore clients like yourself and myself will be able to select whether to buy this panel or that panel based on the level of transparency they have provided us in how they got about to manufacturing it.
That calls for a lot of transparency through like different countries. We're talking about global, and there we have difficulties and different cultures of how much transparency we want to provide. How do we do about that? How do we make sure that we get to understand and really see how things are working?
Well, it's a big question. I think from my perspective, it starts bottom up from where we are, because we are the one trying to finance that transaction. So if the investor are demanding 100% clarity on the sourcing of the equipment, then eventually the owner of the installation company needs to provide that. And then, if you go upstream, eventually he has to select a panel that can give him that. So bottom up, that's the way. Top down, I guess it goes back to the big discussions between, the regulators and the head of states on fair business practices in manufacturing, that being in China or somewhere else.
I mean, you're mentioning one example, but I guess that there are like hundreds of examples just like this, where we need to understand the effect we're having when we're making a choice. To make a choice in that sense is hard. Who is responsible for making the right choice?
The responsible for making the choice is ultimately is the client that is buying the electric car. But I think I go back to the point that there is responsibility from the governments to force the manufacturer to be transparent. So now that car, battery, lithium has been sourced. So there's always a chain. So I'm responsible to choose between car A and car B, but then the regulator should be trying to push for strict transparency requirement on how, where the parts and the components and the raw material of those cars being sourced. I'm now referring to the other issue we have, which is the mining of some of those minerals, which we have seen reports. Some have been basically extracted with practices which will also tilt towards unethical labor conditions.
I'm thinking, if I would be putting myself in your shoes, what it takes here is also some brave people with the money asking the right questions.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a representative of an industry in a sense. How do we make sure that we have more people like you, Salvatore, that are brave, that are asking those kind of questions, that are making sure not to slip one piece in the big chart that we need to understand?
Yeah, and I think that's where I go back to maybe something that we said before. That's where the Nordics seem to be so much ahead. I mean, the clients we have on the investor side, now they all have extremely strict requirements on what they want or not to finance. Our own bank, DNB, will have extremely strict requirements on what we deem to be acceptable or not from a business practice, ESG, and so you have it prospective. So the level of awareness and demands set in the Nordics is actually astonishingly high relative to maybe some of the not so discerning investment decisions which are being made by other investors globally, which are, I would say, a little bit behind the Nordics when it comes to wanting to make sure that their capital has been truly deployed towards clean businesses or projects.
How do we make other countries, continents look at Scandinavian countries and see what we're doing?
Yeah, they do that already to an extent. We speak to a lot of investors in the US, and they do recognize that the Nordics are in the lead when it comes to this. So I think there is progress there. And I think that one thing that will really tip it will be when investors, wherever they are, they realize that if they don't do those checks, it's not just about being bad business, having allocated money to something that wasn't really crystal clean as a business, but it's also a risk on their investments. It is when they realize that they might lose more money or they might make less money if they have not checked thoroughly where that product was made for. If that investor has bought into a solar panel manufacturer without checking where exactly that material in that panel was being sourced from, probably that manufacturer might lose business in the future. So that return on that investment might not be as good as the one of, say, a Nordic pension fund, which actually went to invest into another manufacturer where it was 100% guaranteed that the sourcing of the material was done on fair standards.
So taking a lot of responsibility all the way and making sure that you're circular fully will make sure that you stay alive.
Yes, and that your investments are protected versus those that do not have that circularity and that ability to trace how they run their business.
That's a good incentive, I would say, to really make sure to do the switch. I would like to summarize this a little bit and to see where we are heading. But before that, I would really like to listen to your sunshine.
Sunshine.
Who would you like to give your sunshine to?
Well, we discussed about the moment where awareness was created in the issue we face when it comes to climate. And I think I would like to point out that Greta, with her work and the visibility she managed to achieve, she was a great catalyst and a contributor to that awareness. And at the same time, I think we all feel like her taking less attention in mainstream media because of other events which have recently taken place is somewhat unfair. So if I could, I would also like to see not just her as an individual, but the entire movement taking more center stage again, so that the level of awareness of the issue we face goes back up to be one of, if not the very top issue we have to face as humanity. And then hopefully that gets people started again to cooperate in how to address those issues.
I couldn't agree more. More airtime to Greta. Greta, if you want to come here, we have a place for you, definitely. Airtime for Greta. Thank you very much, Salvatore, for just bringing up also the awareness of the children in this sense, because I think that while listening to them, we learn so much. So I think that that's also a key thing I bring with me. What do you bring? What's your takeaways from today's conversation?
Very interesting, rather difficult to be honest. I'm used to more like a technical financial discussion. This went a little bit off what I usually do on a day-to-day basis, which is refreshing. It's nice to do things where you're uncomfortable. No, I think the work that you're doing to try and increase awareness on the topic is great, and I've been very happy to have participated. And very proud you didn't have to press the red button.
Bullshit.
You were asking for it. You were asking for it. What do you think that if you would tell someone about today's conversation, what would you say? That like, okay, I learned this today, or I've been thinking about this today from.
I think possibly every time I have a conversation about those topics with somebody that maybe sits slightly different from where I sit, I feel that I miss out on some point of view which are fairly reasonable. A couple of times you ask questions where I was like, whoa, where did this one come from? And that makes me feel that it's good to have dialogues and conversations so that people get more of a view of each other's point of view. So to better understand that, it's not just the world that you see, but there is many more angles that one needs to consider.
Thank you. I think that's an awesome push for you then.
Thank you.
Because this is really something we want to give to the audience listening and watching. Thank you, Salvatore, for giving us your view on the world that you're living in. And to summarize from my perspective, I really think that the work you're doing together with DNB is really important. And I think that you are showing it not only with your daily work, but also by making sure that we have an initiative like The Switch, Not Another Podcast.
You're welcome.
Thanks you very much. If you liked this episode, make sure that you share, that you comment, so that we spread the word to as many as possible, because we need to be many in order to do this transition. Make sure you subscribe to The Switch, Not Another Podcast. Until we meet again, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else. Bye.